Good morning to everyone. As Janet mentioned, some of you may know who I am, but been in the industry for a good number of years. Actually, have been the instructor for KEPSC, and I've got the question marks because we've been talking about and trying to remember how long this course has been going on. But I've been privileged to have the opportunity to help serve and help with that since the inception. And so that's part of what as we talk today, as Janet mentioned, we're going to be talking through some of the components of the KYR10 permit, Construction Stormwater General Permit. Some of that definitely ties into the KEPSC Qualified Inspector Program. But what we're wanting to talk about, and really throughout the day, or this morning as we're talking, please, if you've got some thoughts, input, please interject, and especially as we get near the end, we want to get some of your thoughts and input as far as ways that the program can be improved, because those type of recommendations can therefore be passed along to the Kentucky Division of Water, and we can look at maybe addressing some of the challenges that I've heard as I've been teaching the KEPSC course over the years. And just our goal in all of this ultimately is to protect water quality across the Commonwealth. So that's what we want. That's kind of the overarching theme of what we're after today. How can we accomplish that and use the resources that we already have available to us to, again, do a better job of protecting our environment and our water resources? So let's do a little bit of a kind of background. Remember, KYR10 is the state's Construction Stormwater General Permit. And that's the other part we want to remember in this. During this morning, the discussion is all based off of state requirements. I want to remind everybody that your local jurisdiction, some of you MS4s, you've got different requirements, more stringent than the states are. So wherever we're working, we got to just remember the local jurisdiction requirements take precedence over the statewide ones. So just keep that in mind. But pretty much what we're after here under KYR10 is, it gives a description of how can you go about obtaining permit coverage from the Division of Water to handle stormwater runoff from construction sites that disturb an acre or more of land. That's just kind of the broad brush of what that's at. There's a whole lot of detail, some of which we're going to be covering this morning, because specifically it gives the guidance of what we need to follow when we're doing these construction projects out in the field. It was last updated about, so 3.5 years ago. They are typically 5-year permits, so we've got about 1.5 years before the new permit will be updated. And that's part of why I think the beginning of these discussions, as we get later on in this morning, you'll see, I think timely, it's very timely, because if there are some recommendations or improvements the industry feels like need to be made, it gives it time to have those discussions with the Division of Water and as well pass those along, get those implemented. Now, under KYR10, generally you've got 4 main players that you're going to see in the regulation described. And there's generic terms for them, but it's going to be the permittee. That's the person who's going to apply for permit coverage under KYR10. You got the construction site operator, and we'll cover all these in more detail. You've got the SWPPP preparer, that's the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan prepared. And then you've got the inspector, the person out in the field taking a look at things. So again, we'll cover these in detail and kind of what role they play. So usually the permittee, that's going to be the person that, or their assignee, is going to put together, prepare, and submit the notice of intent to get permit coverage under KYR10. Now, KYR10 may not be the only permit that's required out there. If there's other ones, and this gets into the whole discussion, do we have waterways or not? And we won't get into that whole debate this morning. We don't have time. But it's important to know on your project, do you have a waterway? What kind of a waterway classification it is? So that's all got to be determined, and if there's additional permits required, either through the Corps and their 404 permit, or the Division of Water and their water quality certification, or 401 permit, may even have a floodplain permit. So they're required to make sure and check, do they have all those? Now, as a part of it, when they're submitting this notice of intent, they are stating that, hey, a SWPPP is being prepared or has been prepared as a part of this. So either they're doing it or they're hiring somebody to get this work done. And so also in the requirements, they're supposed to sign off saying that they have reviewed all this information, they're on board with it, and they're intending that it's correct and accurate, and they're on board with it. And they sign off on the SWPPP, or again, the permittee and the construction site operator, maybe the same entity wearing the same hat. You know, that's possible as well. Or they may be required to actually implement the stormwater pollution prevention plan. Or again, that might be the construction site operated person. Now, the part to keep in mind with that, the bottom line is their name is the one that's on the permit. So if anything goes wrong, if there's any type of concerns as far as water quality violation or anything, this is the entity that the state, the locals, this is who they're going to go back to. So this person needs to be quite aware of the magnitude of the liability and, you know, and the importance of their job and their role in this process. Then we've got the construction site operators. We mentioned in the previous slide, they may actually sign off on the stormwater pollution prevention plan, or as minimum, typically they're at least responsible for the implementation of the stormwater pollution prevention plan. Now, what does that mean by implementation? Well, pretty much whatever is inside and the contents of that SWPPP, that's what's supposed to be occurring out in the field, or as we'll see here later, there's a lot of administrative type of things that are required too, that those are getting accomplished, as well as making sure maintenance is done. The whole point of well, we'll get to the details of the plan, but you know, there's going to need to be maintenance at some point in the life of the stormwater pollution prevention plan. So that's typically the role for the construction site operator. So that's the second entity of the four we talked about. Now we've got the SWPPP prepared. So they are responsible for doing just that, putting together and developing the stormwater pollution prevention plan. And we'll cover here in a little bit all the information that is supposed to be covered in the SWPPP. And you will see, if you've studied it any, and as we go through the slides, that it's quite extensive. But the big goal of it is the SWPPP is supposed to be designed to make sure that we remove 80% of the total suspended solids from that exceed the pre-development levels of the stormwater runoff. And that is based on a 2-year, 24-hour rain event. So that would be the kind of rain event that would occur once every 2 years that would span over a 24-hour period. Now that's a whole other discussion as well. We've got, you know, folks are hearing all about the changing our weather patterns. We're getting more intense rainstorms. So is the 24-hour event the right one? Should we be looking at 6-hour? You know, that's a whole other thing that can be considered. But right now, that's the criteria it's identified for. So that's when we know that the SWPPP is doing its job and is performing properly. So to do that, what are the basics? Well, the person putting the SWPPP together needs to be knowledgeable about the site and all aspects about the site. And that has to do with, you know, what's the topography like, what's already existing out there currently in this area. What kind of rain do we typically expect? What kind of vegetation is already out there? So, you know, they've got to have a good grasp of what the site is like. And then the other part about this is, like all SWPPPs, it's going to need, it's a live document. And during the life of the project, things are going to change. Something's going to occur that wasn't expected. You know, drainage pattern shifts, change in delivery schedule of equipment, whatever it may be, there's going to be a change in the SWPPP. And so they need to make those modifications, or at least be in coordination with the folks out in the field to get those done. And then especially if there's any kind of thing that has been identified during the inspection, then that needs to get addressed before the next rain event. So that's our third player in this. And then we get to what a lot of the training has been about with the KEPSC, or the inspector. And they're given criteria under KYR 10. What are they supposed to be doing? And how often are they supposed to be doing? So kind of the basic guidance, they're supposed to be out there as a minimum once every 7 days, or you can have option 2 once every 14 days and within 24 hours of a half-inch or greater rain event. So that kind of gives them how often they should be out there. And then what are they doing? Well, they're taking a look to see, did the construction operator implement what was in the SWP preparer had prepared? And so that's their main goal, taking a look. They've got the latest copy of the SWP. They're out there taking a look, okay, yes or no, are things in place where they're supposed to be? Are they installed properly? Are they operating properly? And is maintenance required? And then they document that. So that's a lot of their job, is to observe and document what's going on out in the field. Now, that third bullet there is, in quotes, is direct language straight out of KYR 10. This defines the skill set that the inspector is supposed to have to be able to serve that role in the whole construction process. Now, to get that skill set, then they've also said in the last bullet there, here's some of the training programs that you pass that would be considered that you meet all those skill sets. KEPSC is one of them, and then there's several of the national, CPESC, and other trainings that are identified specifically under KYR 10. So those are a lot of the 4 players you've got involved in permitting a construction site from a stormwater perspective. So got a question for you. And Jan's going to pull up the polling question for us. If you'll take a look at that and answer the question there.
All right, we got the majority, so I'll share it.
All right. So the question is, check which entity or entities needs to pass a qualification exam according to KYR 10. And we've had the 4 answers: SWP preparer, permittee, inspector, and construction site operator. Most of the folks answered inspector, and that would be correct. We got a few under the SWP preparer and permittee. And it's fair to say, and if you look at all those requirements and understandings that those players, the SWP preparer and permittee, have to have, but that's the concern with the current condition. They don't have any training. And so, our formal opportunity for education in this. So part of what we're looking at is, what are some ways, again, if we've got 4 players and only one of the 4 players has the opportunity or the requirement to have a certain qualification or training, how can we catch the other 3 players up to speed so the whole team is working with the same knowledge base? I mean, right now, I know the inspectors try to educate everybody, keep them on board, but that's harder. So what can we look at? And so what we're going to focus on today is really taking a look at that SWP prepare. That is really the foundational document for a construction project that everything revolves around, because that's what the construction site operator is supposed to be implementing, and that's what the inspector is going to be taking a look at. Is that what's getting implemented? So let's take a look at what this stormwater pollution prevention plan is. And there's lots of resources out there. The state has them, EPA has them, but let's kind of look over it if you haven't ever had the opportunity to really look at what should go in here. And so a lot of this guidance, again, comes straight out of KYR 10. That's the document that we're using because that's the permit we're after. So the big part here is it's a detailed plan. And as we go through all of this, these next 10, 12 slides, it spells out all the things under KYR 10 that are supposed to be incorporated in the SWPPP. And you'll see there's a lot of information. So it's got to be a detailed plan. A lot of things happen out on the job site. And so that's what we've got to be prepared for. So fundamentally, it's just identifying where are the potential pollutant sources. Once you identify them, okay, what's going to be done to try to keep those potential pollutant sources from becoming a problem, and that we're protecting the water quality. So if you take a look at that, I mean, most of the time we think about, in the first bullet there, it talks about it, the sediment. We're usually thinking of dirt. And makes sense, a lot of pollutants attach themselves to the dirt particles. Okay, so that makes sense, but there's a lot of other things, and again, we'll get into that, of what we call the good housekeeping type of measures that are also just as important as any of the rest of this. And then the last bullet really has to do with there are administrative type of requirements under KYR 10 that need to be considered. And a lot of times on job sites, the administrative part isn't a high priority. The goal is to get the project built. And so that's, again, why all the players need to understand what needs to be done and how are we going to go about it, with the goal being we want to protect water quality. That's our goal across, I mean, as a part of this program. And that gets into a whole other criteria, because if we don't protect water quality, then, you know, we have the opportunity, or we have the unfortunate position of not being able to get permits. So we want to all work together in the same direction. So how do you go about developing a SWPPP? Now that we generally know what this thing is about, how do you go about it? So we kind of mentioned this before. You have to assess the site. And a lot of folks are trying to use tools using Google Earth, things like that. And that's helpful. I think it can give you a good big picture type of view. But as we get through these slides, you're going to understand the level of detail that is really required to put together a good SWPPP. You're going to have to really be out there on the job site to be able to fully understand how does stormwater runoff function out at that job. So other things we're going to need to know that is very important is, what do we want to protect out there? You know, many things you hear on residential subdivisions, people like to have mature trees as a part of their landscaping. Okay, how are we going to go about protecting those? If we have any type of waterway, there are specific requirements we have to incorporate if it's a defined waterway. So we need to know all those things. You know, do we have any sinkholes? Obviously, that's an important thing to know in the area. We don't want to, whatever's getting built to be collapsing in the future. We see enough of that on the news, so we need to pay attention to that. And, you know, these are kind of things to know on the site. But the other part about this is just, what is the project? How is it going to get built? And so it begins to shift from not just knowing what's the land we're working with, but how is this project going to go about getting built? And so you got to know what are the project phases. And why is that important? Because the way they're going to build it, those best management practices have to be designed accordingly and lined up with them. And these are some of the big areas we're hearing and seeing in the industry as some of the challenges, is just making sure we've got those lined up well. So again, the BMPs can work effectively as they can. And then what are the inspections? You know, how are those going to be done? When are they going to be done? At what point in time does a best management practice need to have maintenance performed? All that should be covered and specifically, you know, detailed out in the SWPPP. So let's get into some of the real nitty gritty. And again, every single one of these items are spelled out and laid out in KYR 10. So it is a permit requirement. And that's just, what is the project? What are we trying to build? Where are we trying to build it? You know, just the real fundamentals of it. I've looked at several SWPPPs, and it can be amazing how, you know, I guess because everybody's that has been a part of this project already knows what it's about. They just kind of jump in past what are the basics. But if you've got somebody picking up SWP for the first time, they need to know, what are we working with here? Now, that's one thing to bring out. The SWP itself, the Kentucky Division of Water does not require that the SWP be submitted to them to get permit coverage. Okay, not required. But your local jurisdiction may require it. So just keep that in mind, that more likely not, somebody's going to be taking a look at these SWP documents. So what's the project about? What's the area of the entire site that's going to be worked on? What's the area that's going to get disturbed? Now, that's an important part, because the SWP is going to be prepared and designed according to what part of the project's going to get disturbed. So it's important to make sure that, dozer operator doesn't get a little bit out of hand and clear too much of the land, because that'll change the flow dynamics. So important to know that. Need to know about the receiving water. Where is our site draining to? Ultimately, it's going to get to some kind of waters of the Commonwealth. Well, those waterways, many of them, they all have a use classification. And according to the use classification, they may also have a designated buffer area or area of unimpacted vegetation that we're not supposed to disturb. So very important to know that, and that get incorporated into the SWP. So those are a lot of things, again, associated with the site itself. But it also included in this group is these how is the project going to get built? What are kind of the steps? And what sequence are those going to come together in? And so we really begin to try to marry the water quality protection and the BMPs with the construction activities themselves. Be able to do that, you got to know both. You got to know the mechanics of good BMPs, but you got to know how the project's going to get built too. And that'll be a real strong thing we'll come back to. You got to have a site map. What are we trying to deal? We're trying to address stormwater runoff. So you got to know where the stormwater is going to run off. And during the life of the project, that may change, especially if we have a lot of grading work that's going on. We may have a certain drainage pattern up front before construction begins. Slightly thereafter, we may have a completely different drainage pattern, and then maybe another one once we get to final grade. So all that needs to be factored in, and you need to have those different phases and those BMPs for those different parts of the life of the project. You need to know what are the limits of disturbance. Again, the SWP is designed based on a certain area. So got to make sure that that's stayed within. Obviously, you want to stay within the property limits of the project. And all these sound good. And often, those of you that have had an opportunity to look at a SWP drawing, they're shown there. But there's a big difference between just looking at a map and then walking out in the field before any construction began, and where is that actually out in the field. So making sure these documents can be readily utilized out in the field, another important part of consideration. Then other things, what kind of best management practices are going to be used? Where are they going to be located? What size are they? How long, how deep, how wide? All that kind of information should be provided. And again, that's to be able to manage that 2-year, 24-hour rain event. If we've got any type of unique geography, any type of feature out in the landscape that we want to protect, all that needs to be identified, needs to be flagged off. Where are you going to store materials and equipment? There again, how's the SWP preparer going to know that if they haven't worked or coordinated with the folks that are going to do the construction work? How do they know where that's going to be accomplished? Now, in many cases, things like that, your SWP document is going to probably have two components. You're going to have the drawing set, that kind of helps show visually where things go. And then you're going to have some kind of written text or a whole bunch of notes, maybe on the drawings, to give give some more detail. So just keep in mind, there's typically two parts to a complete SWPPP document. And so maybe if they haven't figured out exactly where some of these things are going to be located, at least there's some description or guidance provided. Where would these go? Here's some things to consider in locating them, things like that. Our concrete washout, where's the dumpster going to go? All those types of things. And then one of the very important parts is, how are you going to gain access to the site? In many cases, we don't want folks just running in and out from all directions, because they're going to end up with mud on the tires, and we don't want all that mud out on our public roadways. So want to manage that so we can have a construction ingress, egress. All right, this goes on. What other things? Now, this is more kind of some of the administrative stuff, but again, all part of the requirements. The person that's put the SWPPP together, they're supposed to document and say, yes, we are knowledgeable about the requirements of KWire 10. We're knowledgeable about the site, the soils, because runoff and the amount of soil particles in that runoff and how well they settle out or can be filtered out, that's going to depend upon what the soil particle is. Excuse me. So they need to be familiar and know what's going on there. Then you've got some of these other kind of I call them good thinking kind of practices. How do we go about building this, minimizing the area that it's disturbed at any point in time, and minimizing the length of time that it's disturbed? Because if it's already there, well vegetated, we shouldn't have to worry too much about it. But as soon as we disturb it, then we've got to make sure that we implement practices to manage it and keep that pollutant latent runoff on site. And then the other parts to keep in mind, if we've got clean, maybe we're working on a slope and we've got clean water that's coming down onto our project, well, how can we divert it around our project so we're not having to incorporate this clean water into our construction activities and then deal with it all? If it's cleaner water, let's divert it around our project. Much easier to manage. Actually, I just got done looking at a project, and unfortunately, they didn't do that. And this additional water was just basically overpowering their practices and causing downstream problems. So, very good thing to consider if that can be incorporated. And other kind of basics, as water moves downhill, it's going to gain energy. And as it gains energy, it becomes more erosive. So how can we slow that water down? Can we keep it more in sheet flow? When it's in sheet flow, it's not as erosive as once we get into concentrated flow. So all those things hopefully have been incorporated in the thought process of putting this SWPPP document together. And a big part of this with the looking at the amount of rainfall and runoff and all that, really what they're looking at is how much volume of water do we need to deal with, and how quickly is that water going to come to us. And again, with changing weather patterns, things are coming harder and faster than they have in the past, so it makes it more challenging. So there's a lot of things already covered there, a lot having to do with focus on dirt. Typically we think of, and so combining that with the water we get with the mud. But then there's a whole list of, generically we call these good housekeeping measures. Every single bullet on here is specifically called out in KWire 10 and needs to be addressed somewhere in the SWPPP document. The basics, where are we going to cover the construction material? Kind of talked about this. Litter and waste management, big one. This actually got updated in the last round of the permit, is that the waste containers have to have lids on them. Part of the reason for that is we were getting trash and other things blowing around. Out on the job site. So that's one source of pollutant. The other part is just you get the rainwater mixed with the contents inside the dumpster. The dumpsters aren't watertight. And so you got the mixture of those that are, coming out of the bottom of it, and that needs to be managed as well. So part of the goal there is keeping lids on them and keeping them under storage. And that is a requirement under KWIR 10 that those be covered at the end of each business day. Then just going through a few others, just pour some concrete. The concerns there with concrete, besides the finished product, you don't want that getting rained on, but there's admixtures inside of the concrete, and those can be toxic if those get washed out into our local waterways. So I want to keep that in mind. Fueling operations, that another important part. How's that fueling going to be done for the equipment that are out there? Is there a on-site fueling tank? Is it going to be done with mobile fuelers? All those types of things need to be thought through, and how's it going to be managed so during the fueling operations we're not leaking any water or any of the fueling out onto the ground, which then get washed when we have a rain event. Spill management, another one of those real good important ones. Where's the spill kit out on the job site? People, are they trained on use of a spill kit? It's inevitable, probably something's going to get spilled somewhere in the life project. How's that going to be dealt with? And with chemicals, typically we think of chemicals, something harsh, things like that, but fertilizer is a chemical. Often you'll have fertilizer on site once we get to the vegetation, trying to get it to stand fast growing. So all that needs to be factored and considered. Again, every single one of those is specifically called out in KWIR 10. Now we kind of begin to shift from the knowledge base, what you need to know about the site. And now it begins to shift into more of what you need to know about the construction part of how the project's going to get built. Because the goal is, what we want to accomplish is at this point, and really this is from the inspector's point of view, whether this inspector is part of this process or if it's an MS4 inspector or Division of Water inspector, they want to be able to look in the SWPPP and go, okay, we're at this point in the life of the project. Based on that, here's what I should see BMP wise out in the field. That should be easy to line up. Well, to do that, like I said, you got to know how are things going to get built, in what order, what sequence, in a construction timeline. That's another requirement. The construction schedule. Those have to all get lined up on this. And we also don't want to forget, if we've got projects where we've got a lot of earth moving going on, wherever the borrow pile is, if there is a site like that, or the spoil, that's all considered part of the project as well. So, from inspection and BMP, SWPPP preparation, all that needs to be factored in. We've got pretty basics, as far as BMP proper installation. The state has standard details for that. Many local communities have their own standard details. So that's pretty fundamental, and those get incorporated in the SWPPP document, not a problem. Maintenance schedule, EPA gives a basic guidance. They like it once the best management practice is a third, the volume or the height, things like that. So all that, from a maintenance perspective, how they should get installed, that all should be incorporated in the SWPPP as well. And we go on. Again, if you think about this, all of these things that are called out or that we're seeing on the slides are specifically called out in KWIR 10 and supposed to be addressed somewhere in that SWPPP document. Next big part is, okay, we have some type of water discharge, but it's not associated with stormwater. And so what could that have to do with? Just highlighting a few here, you may be flushing a fire hydrant. New development, they install a new water line, they need to flush it and clean it. But it could be just the water, for dust control. I've seen water trucks overdo it, and they spread too much water and you do end up with a muddy mess. So how's that going to get managed? Or maybe say on the job site, they've dug a footer, it rained, footer filled up with water. How are you going to remove that water from the footer? And that all needs to be incorporated. It'll probably be done with a sock or a bag at the end of the discharge. Something like that needs to be covered in the SWPPP document. And we go on. Now this gets a little more focused on the inspection portion of this. And it should cover what kind of inspection frequency. Again, we talked about earlier that there's a minimum under KWIR 10, but there may be a different criteria incorporated into SWPPP. So that needs to be factored in, and the inspections need to be done at that frequency. Then the report. What kind of report? Is there a certain form that has to be used? The state currently does not have any standard format for a report. They give you guidance as far as information that needs to be incorporated in that, but does not have to, follow a certain format. But is there one that needs to be followed? And we mentioned earlier, the permittee or construction site operator needs to sign off. All the players, subcontractors, they are signing off on this SWPPP document saying, yes, they've reviewed it. They're going to implement it. Very important parts. Then there's a few other kind of unique areas that the KWIR 10 calls about that needs to be incorporated in this and identified. Has to do with a critical area. The critical area is within, oh gosh, I got to remember, I think it's 25 feet and draining towards waters of the Commonwealth. So that could be areas along our lakes, rivers. Also includes a sinkhole, because our underground river system is also incorporated as waters of the Commonwealth. So for sure, that would need to get identified on the SWPPP documents. Another reason why some of those sinkholes aren't readily able to be seen, from Google Earth type of scale, why it's important to be out there. What kind of other types of practice, any type of practices, that's something to keep in mind too. For each of these BMPs, it needs to be spelled out specifically what BMP. We don't want a SWPPP just to say, put in an erosion control here. Need to know what one, what size, what length, all those details need to be provided. And we talked about those buffer zones. If we do have a defined waterway on our project, the state has certain requirements of a buffer zone, or basically an undisturbed vegetated area alongside these waterways that needs to be maintained. And so that needs to be incorporated in SWPPP documents. And that's one in particular, real important. It's great to just kind of draw a line on a drawing, be so far away, but that probably needs to get incorporated or flagged somehow out in the field as well. So the site operator knows where to implement it. Now, who prepares the SWPPPs now? Generally speaking, some folks will rely on licensed professional engineers. Otherwise, it's just kind of like people that believe they can put one together and comply with KWIR 10. That's okay. There's no specific guidance. Well, there's a couple problems with this challenge, or there's a couple challenges associated with this. I don't know if some of you remember back in the day, with the Nutty Professor, that's where that little snippet's from. You may be very knowledgeable, but are you knowledgeable specifically about construction activities and stormwater management on construction activities? And so that's one of the things we really want to look at focusing on, is making sure the SWPPP preparer has the tools they need and the qualifications they need so that we end up with good SWPPP documents. From my experience, licensed professional engineers, that's great. They have some training, but if they've not had the privilege and opportunity to be working out in the field, would they understand the sequencing of the BMPs along with the construction activity? That takes some time with being able to work out in the field. So what other challenges? So that's kind of one set of challenge that we're seeing and have heard from folks, again, as we've been teaching the courses over the years. So there's some other challenges, and this is more administrative or just kind of logistical. Many times, let's say a municipality wants to design something. And so they hire an engineer to do it. They want to be able to get KYR 10 permit coverage to speed up the process and not have to wait until after the contractor's been hired. And so the design engineer puts together some erosion prevention sediment control notes, kind of, I like to call it like a SWPPP light. They got some of the basics in there, but again, they haven't talked to the contractor because the contractor hadn't been hired yet. How do we, how are you planning to go about building this? And so you end up with kind of the light version. Well, how do you get from the light version to a complete set to be able to go out in the field? That's part of the challenge. Now, there is actually under KYR 10, there's language already under there where the permit can get transferred to another entity. So if the municipality got the permit to begin with, but once they hire it, they could transfer it. But the question is this part of KYR 10 used? Well, I actually reached out to the folks and at the Division of Water, and they said of roughly 900 permits that they've looked through, there was 3 that they actually used the transfer mechanism. And I know there's been a lot more situations than that where the permit needed to get transferred. So maybe just making that, educating the construction site operators that tool is available would be helpful. And then the other challenges that I continue to hear out there is just, okay, the development of the SWPPP, implementation of SWPPP, it just costs too much money. And, it's killing our projects. So how can we address some of these challenges? And this is based on, and this is where I really would like y'all's input, and based on some input that we've gotten some folks, from previous discussions. And we're looking forward to that opportunity. How do we improve our industry? How, continuous improvement. What can we do? What's the next steps? So here's one thing we are looking at proposing to think about is, since the SWPPP is just, the hinge pin of what occurs out on the construction site, how can we make sure that the folks that put these documents together are qualified, have the skill sets that they need and the tools they need to be able to do a good job and do it cost effectively? So a couple things that we were thinking about is having the KYR 10, similar to what you have for a KEPSC qualified inspector, have the same type of thing for a SWPPP preparer. Give them the opportunity to go through training and to get the knowledge they need to be able to put together a good document. And one of the big things with that, and one of the biggest challenges we see, have to do with those drawings in particular. And what often happens is throughout the life of a project, you'll just have one drawing with all the different BMPs shown on it. And it gets hard to differentiate, okay, at what point in the life of the project should this BMP actually go in place? So some states are actually requiring, and local communities are saying, hey, as a minimum, you need to have a drawing for each stage of the life of the project, as you're changing grades and so forth. That'd be a real helpful tool. Again, not a whole lot more work has to be done there, but it gets that thinking so that we are lining up our construction activities with our BMPs. The other thing is, okay, as was covered in the previous 10, 12 slides, there's a lot of information that needs to go in that SWPPP. So let's put together a template that folks could use and have as a good starting point. We got to be careful. Every project's and every site's different. But there is some boilerplate information that can be provided to them. And then as well, at least here's all the things, according to KWR 10, you need to go in there, provide them with the tools, or at least we'll get into details, kind of what we're thinking to help with that. The other part that this would do is provide a standardization of the SWPPs across the Commonwealth. That's the other challenge we're hearing from a lot of folks is, every SWPP preparer does it a little different right now. Uses different symbols, uses different information, it's in different places. And so, from the municipal SWPP reviewer's perspective, it'd be nice and help them streamline if things are supposed to come in a certain order. So that's something else to keep in mind. Now, often what happens, though, is you throw out new ideas or, hey, how can we look at doing things maybe different or a little better? Okay, I refer to it as the bleeding edge, or has anybody else ever done this? So we looked into this a little bit, and there are other programs out there. There was kind of a list on the left. Other of the states around us didn't go nationwide, but pretty much, communities around the South and the Midwest. And you've got half a dozen states there on the left that already have requirements in their permit or in their language for the SWPPP preparers need to have a certain level of training. So that's already out there. And then we've got other states, and even EPA has it, where they've got SWPPP templates. And, these good documents, good parts to start with, and again, help standardize it across the state as well. So you wouldn't have to be on the front end trying to lead the charge. We've got good resources available to us. So how would this look going forward? And this is kind of just, again, based on some discussions with folks, initial kind of vision, is you get the SWPPP preparer, they could be qualified in this process similar to KEPSC. It's been an effective program, again, been in however long it's been, Janet, 12, 15 years out there now. But, have a forum where they are given the opportunities to, just like we've quickly done here today, going through all the components required in the SWPPP, just to help remind them how that's done. Also give them the contents, they're going to be talking about and using these BMPs, making sure they understand how BMP functions, what the soils, how that makes a difference in how you go about your calculations and putting the SWPPP together. Just what is the basics of erosion and then sediment control. Big part is about third from the bottom there is the other part is, and this is a challenge of engineers in general, I can vouch for that, is, many times we've got it clear in our mind that looks good on our drawing, but how do we make sure you take what's on that drawing and get it out in the field? And so just providing some, I guess, tips or guidance as far as how can you make that document so it can actually get implemented in the field cost effectively, with our goal being protecting water quality. And then also with this, they'd be trained on this tool, this template, so that they can learn how to use it and then go through a qualification process. Now, they probably need to be requalified every so often, just like most anything. You need to have some kind of continuing education requirements, or have a requalification actual program. Part of the main reason for that is because KWR 10 is going to be updated, at least typically every 5 years. So we want to make sure everybody's got the most recent information available to them and that they're knowledgeable about it. Now, what would some folks have been concerned and brought up, well, yeah, if you have a SWPPP template, though, once somebody gets it, then it's out there and anybody can use it. But some states have gotten very creative in how they can try to manage that. So only really the people that have got the qualifications have access to the SWPPP template. And so that kind of helps manage a little bit to make sure we've got people knowing how to use the tool, or the ones that have the tool available to them. But the goal would be, you'd have check boxes, you'd have drop-down menus, things like that. So a lot of the development of the SWP should save them some time. And then as well, there'd be checklists, things like that to help the SWP preparer make sure that they've incorporated it. Now, what about those other challenges? So that, that covered some about SWP preparer, but we talked about several other challenges early on. Well, how this could address it, how can we move from the municipality or the engineer prepared the SWP light to getting a full SWP? Well, if we have a standard type of template, then the contractor could readily take that and factor that, complete it with their construction schedule, their construction sequencing, and fill that out. And we can educate them how to go about transferring the permit over to their name. And from talking to the Division of Water, there's kind of the process for how you transfer a KYR10 permit. Not hard at all. Just get online. There's a button there, select or transfer permit, fill in their own information, hit submit. So, but a lot of folks didn't know about it. To be honest, I didn't even know about it until I started digging into it. So there's some useful tools there. So the goal would be to reduce the cost of things, because that was the other challenge. Folks were talking about, hey, things are just costing too much here. So the goal would be, if we've got better educated and they've got more tools for the SWP preparers, then the cost for the SWP preparation could go down. Ultimately, they'd be more effective. We shouldn't have silt fences running across the top of the hill like I still see on a lot of SWP documents. Things like that, so that they really understand what they're doing. And then with the template, again, it should be more cost effective, hopefully be reducing the time of those folks that are reviewing the SWP templates, so that the whole process gets a little bit more streamlined. So we're reducing costs, and the ability to protect the environment's going up. So that's a lot of talking about kind of what we're looking at or thinking about and hearing from people, but I'm always interested, what do y'all think? And so I'll open it up, or Janet, if you've got things in the chat like to share, really would like to hear people's input.
Let me just take a second, John, to thank you, and thank you all for attending. Just in case anyone needs to jump off, but we appreciate you being here this morning. I did put some of the announcement links back in the chat in case you missed that earlier this morning, and then I added on an evaluation for this webinar. If you don't mind to take a moment to fill that out, especially if you have a webinar topic you'd like to see. We do always look out for other topics to add to our schedule. So, and like I said, our next KEPSC training is coming up May 3rd at Barren River. So if you need to jump off to another meeting, we totally understand, but John and I are going to hang on to take questions. I already see a couple in the chat. So John, the first question, is there a good online website for calculating watershed area to help determine potential runoff to certain points on a project?
Oh, that's good. Many states have, well, local communities do too, have a GIS program that can help you with calculations. I'm trying to think, is there any, and somebody else, sorry, I'm not so good on the GIS side. I usually have somebody help me with that. But I do know there are resources. I'd have to dig in that more to see from a statewide level, where is that web page. If anybody's on that may have input, that would be great.
If you have something to crowdsource, just add it to the chat. But the next question we have is, what would be some pros and cons of transferring the KYR10 permit?
Very good question. So kind of back to the person whose name's on the permit, ultimately they're held accountable of what's going out in the field. So if, say, the municipality was the initial permit holder, they just have to understand if something goes wrong out in the field, the construction site operator caused it, the municipality will still be held liable because their name's on the permit. So usually it's good to put responsibility and accountability kind of all in the same entity.
And back to Paul's question, someone put in the chat to check out stream stats for drainage area. So thanks for that.
There you go. Thank you.
Another question, John, you mentioned towards the beginning about KDOW not having to be contacted for a SWP to be valid. Can you kind of re-explain what you meant by that?
Okay. Yeah, sorry if I was confusing there. So when the permittee is submitting a notice of intent for permit coverage, one of the line items in there for the application says you have prepared a SWP. So the permittee, when applying for the permit, has to confirm, yes, they have a SWP prepared, but actually that SWP document does not need or is not submitted to the state for their review and approval. I know we are running out of time. If anybody does still need to reach out to me or have other questions or something comes to you later in the day, just there's contact information you can ask. And like I said, we're just looking at how can we make things better in this whole process under KYR 10. So if you've got other ideas, by all means, we want to hear them.
If you think of another question, you can always fill out that tech assist form. We're here to help you all. So if there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and end the call.